Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Critical Elements of Conducting Early Phase Clinical Trials in the U.S. for APAC Sponsors. My name is Sonia Hunt and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout this presentation by using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require assistance, please contact me at any time by sending me a message using that chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank ARG Atlantic Research Group, who developed the content for this presentation. ARG is a contract research organization focused on oncology, immunology, and neurology, providing comprehensive clinical program development services ranging from pre-launch consulting to commercialization, achieving over 50 market authorizations to date. Founded in 2004 with the vision that every project should be highly individualized, ARG has experienced consistent growth across the globe, expanding their reach to include drug and device strategic consulting, clinical trial management services, and clinical data and analytic solutions. ARG uses first-in-class technology platforms along with relationship-driven flexibility to optimize clinical studies because they believe everyone deserves to be well. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today's webinar. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Frank Lee. He's the founder of BLA Regulatory. Dr. Frank Lee is the founder of BLA Regulatory based in Maryland, USA. He is an expert in clinical and regulatory affairs. Dr. Lee has been working in the biopharmaceutical industry for more than 16 years. Dr. Lee has had many successful investigational new drug and clinical trial applications preparation and approvals worldwide for clients, including Asian and Pacific regions, as a regulatory professional. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jane Fang. She has 25 years of unique multidisciplinary experience in medical practice, life science research, and global biopharmaceutical and R&D across the US and China. She is the CEO and founder of Polaris Strategic Partners, Inc. Her broad global expertise in clinical development strategy, clinical trial conduct, and digital innovation has helped emerging and growing biotechs develop their plans to go global in seamless and culturally sensible ways. Trained as a research physician with deep knowledge of both China and US healthcare systems and clinical trial environment, Dr. Fang has extensive global study experience in oncology, autoimmune and respiratory diseases, metabolic and cardiovascular diseases, infectious diseases, and vaccine development. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Victoria Allgood, Vice President of Scientific Affairs Oncology with Atlantic Research Group, ARG. Dr. Victoria Allgood, with experience in the US, UK, and EU across all oncology indications, is adept in depth design, development, implementation, and completion of early phase first-in-man studies through pivotal trials. Dr. Allgood's specific expertise ranges from small molecules and pathway-targeted agents to complex and personalized cell-based therapeutics and novel recombinant molecules, as well as diagnostic and prognostic molecules and assays. Victoria holds both a BS in chemistry and a PhD in physiology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Now, before I pass over the mic to our first speaker, Frank, we have our first poll question for our audience members to interact with in real time. That's going to be appearing on your screen right now. And there it is. Now, you can go ahead and vote on this question by clicking on any of the answers. And the question is, what is your company's history or plan on conducting trials in the US? So you have 4 options to choose from. We have taken trials to the US in the past, we will take a trial to the US in the next 12 months, or we will take a trial to the US in the next 2 to 5 years. And then the final option is we have no plans right now to take a trial to the US. So please go ahead and cast your votes. I'll give you another 20 seconds to complete this simple poll question. And once I close the polls, we'll take a look at the results, and then I'll pass the mic over to our first speaker. Okay, that looks like it's the majority of our audience. There's still a few more people out there who have not cast their votes. Can you go ahead and do so now? I greatly appreciate that. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in our first poll questions. I'm now going to close the polls. Okay, so let's take a look at the results. Okay, in our audience, we have 59% who have taken their trials to the US in the past. 18% say we will take a trial to the US in the next 12 months, and then 14% of our audience say we will take a trial to the US in the next 2 to 5 years, while only 9% say we have no plans right now to take a trial to the US. So thank you everyone for participating in that first poll question. Now it's my pleasure to pass over the mic over to Frank. So Frank, before you begin, would you like to comment on the results of that poll question? Are you surprised?
Absolutely not, actually. I think 90% of the company, they plan where they're already in the US to conduct clinical trials. That's actually my assumption too, based on the US data, the marketing data. Actually, I think 58% of the new drugs approved in the US actually first approved in the US. So that was why most of the company, they do want to their drug development conducted in the US.
Okay, well, thank you so much for commenting on that. I'll leave it over to you now to start your presentation.
Thank you, Sonia, for the introduction. Yeah, this is the slides. In order to conduct a clinical trial in the US, so you have to obtain formally we call it exemption from the FDA. Exempt your approved drug to be used in human in the US or conduct a clinical trial. Legal word is not approval, it's called exemption from the prohibition interstate commerce. So that's the basic of the IND part. So today I will focus on the regulatory elements from the pre-IND and then foreign clinical data for IND and IND stage and IND drug import after the IND becomes active. Next slide. So the communication with the FDA during drug development is an important process that may involve multiple FDA and sponsor interactions. As you can see in this slide, at the different stages of the drug development, there are different communication channels and formats to use to communicate with the FDA. Today, I will focus on the pre-IND stage, the pre-IND meeting to use. So that is when you move your products from the pre-IND stage to the IND stage, it is better to communicate with FDA to seek FDA's feedback to your product. Next slide. The reasons for pre-IND, there's multiple reasons, but important things to remember, pre-IND is an option, but not required by the FDA. It is up to the sponsor if they want to use the pre-IND meeting opportunity to seek feedback to their IND drug. So what you can get from the pre-IND meeting, you can help ensure a complete IND application is submitted and also potentially avoid clinical hold, because the clinical hold will put your drug on hold before you can start the human trial unless you address all the concerns you received from the FDA. The pre-IND meeting also is a formal opportunity to gather the FDA's perspective, recommendations, and the preliminary agreement on critical aspects of your development program, such as important clinical study design. Pre-IND meeting is also an opportunity to build a constructive relationship with the FDA, because all the meeting attendees from the FDA side probably will be the reviewer of your IND dossier once you submit it to the FDA. Especially for products that is first in human, or a new mode of action, or with some safety concern from MOA or from the impurity of your drug or clinical tox studies, and that probably is a better way to talk with the FDA to get feedback from the FDA. The other thing is worth to mention is the pre-IND meeting is free. It's not like other regions, most of the regions I know, they will charge a fee to have a pre-IND meeting. But in the US, during the entire IND stage, there's a free, no charge until you apply for a marketing application, then there will be a charge. Next slide. So the timing of a pre-IND meeting is also important. Sometimes it is not easy to make a decision on when to request the pre-IND meeting. Whether it is better to have an early pre-IND meeting without GLP tox data, or wait to have a tox data in the meeting package. Sometimes the company, are struggling to make a decision. So the pre-IND meeting, actually, we can categorize. This is not by the idea, just by practice in the industry. There's early pre-IND meetings and later pre-IND meetings. The difference is what's a GLP tox data or without a tox data. So the early pre-IND meeting is typically to discuss overall approach to preclinical program, especially the tox program design. This is especially important to some unique product that is with a new MOA or some other unique program is different from other general small molecule, large molecule product. And also, what's FDA to confirm the program is sufficient to address risk to initiate the first time in human study. And also is opportunity to discuss of development program scope and also discuss the feature of the initial clinical study design. But at this stage, it is not easy because you don't have the tox data. You don't know whether the initial dose is appropriate to start the clinical trial. The later pre-IND study is different because you already have a tox data. You can discuss the clinical design, the initial dose, and the escalation of the dose, the scheme. So that is make sure the data actually no risk to support the clinical trial, and also your tox data package is sufficient to support the clinical trial to start. It is able to discuss any surprise from the GLP tox. If you see there's any signal, safety signal, it's also good opportunity to discuss with the FDA whether it's a risk to the product to start the human trial. Next slide. So the pre-IND meeting basically is a type B meeting. It's a 60-day process. On day 0, the meeting requests are submitted, and the FDA will start to assess the meeting request. The meeting request usually contain a list of draft questions. It's not a totally final, but near final questions, including CMC questions, non-clinical questions, or clinical questions, or even regulatory questions you want to ask. Maybe there's based on the animal pharmacology data, you can submit some, you can use some special regulatory programs. So FDA, before day 21, FDA will provide feedback, whether grant the meeting or what format of the meeting, either face-to-face meeting, teleconference, or written response. is really based on the request of the meeting format in your meeting request document. For the past 2 years, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is rarely face-to-face meeting. There rarely TC, but most of my program actually is a written response. On day 30, once you get the meeting granted, you have to submit a meeting package at least 30 days prior to the meeting. So once you submit the meeting package, FDA will review the meeting package. The meeting package needs to have sufficient information, the background information to support FDA to understand your product and then provide meaningful answers to the question you ask. So FDA will usually provide pre-meeting communication feedback a few days prior to the meeting, if it's a face-to-face meeting or teleconference. And the sponsor has a few days, I think usually 24 or 48 hours, to provide feedback to FDA, address FDA the pre-meeting communication feedback, and let FDA know what questions or feedback you want to discuss at the meeting. That's save time, not to go over the questions. But for written response, that's pretty much it, the initial response you need to assess. There's no immediate channels to send back to FDA your response. You need to assess the feedback and make sure the recommendation or the feedback addressed in your IND dossier when you submit the IND package to the FDA. So after the meeting, if the meeting is a face-to-face or teleconference, FDA will issue a meeting minute within 30 days after the meeting. So that's pretty much the procedure for the pre-IND meeting. I'm not talking about the content, but the general procedure, because the content is very different between projects and the product. Next slide. Based on my experience from my clients, some of the clients came from Asia Pacific countries. So they usually have some phase 1A data, or they conduct the study in Australia. So they want to use this data to skip or reduce some study arm, or can go to the phase 2, or have some breeding study, go to the phase 2 to save some time for the drug development. So the general principle for foreign clinical data for IND, you still need to make sure you are GCP compliant. In your study report, you may make a statement about the GCP compliance. The GCP compliance also including IRB and EC review of your protocol or your drug package. They approve this clinical trial in human. So those information are important in the IND package. You may provide those information in the summary section. It's a module 2.5 or module 2.7. Next slide. So the general requirement for the foreign clinical data, you have to mention the clinical trial information, whether both in the US or other country or only other country. And also the clinical site information, whether meet requirement or FDA 21 CFR 312.120. So this is a regulation CFR numbers. And also you probably needed to provide investigator information based on 21 CFR, the requirement. It's not necessarily when you submit it, you provide all the things, because sometimes you have a poor study report, list the clinical site, who is the PI, and provide some information in the CSR. The CSR is the clinical study report, and also module 2.5 or module 2.7 when you introduce those clinical trials. Next slide. This is actually an example using non-US data support a marketing application. This is not for the IND. This is actually for a marketing application. As you can see, there's two studies. The bottom study, actually the phase 1 study, this study was conducted in 25 sites worldwide, including Australia, US, UK, and other European countries. And the second study is a phase 2 study. This purely was conducted in China, 13 sites. This is a company called Beijing, USA. So they actually submitted a marketing application based on the data set from the two studies, a purely China study and a phase 1 global study. So this product actually was approved using an accelerated approval regulatory pathway. So this is to show you that non-US data can be used not only in the IND stage, but also marketing application stage. Next slide. This is a very general, the IND dossier used in many countries, regions. I know China, US, Japan, Korea, European countries, they all use this formatting, for the IND submission. You have at the bottom 3 modules. Module 3 quality is a CMC. Module 4 is a non-clinical study report, including animal pharmacology tox report. And module 5 is a clinical study. Most of the time for initial IND, that will be clinical protocol, ICF, and also investigator information. So the module 2 will be the summary of those data, the CMC non-clinical. If this is a first in human study for your product, there's no need for clinical overview or clinical summary. But non-clinical overview, non-clinical summary will be needed because you have your non-clinical data to support the initiation of the IND study. Next slide. So this is the IND review process. This is really purely a procedure wise. There's a 30-day review period. Once FDA receives the IND package, FDA may send a information request or question anytime during the 30 days. But most cases, that will be the 3rd week. FDA sent information request, either CMC, non-clinical, will ask you revise your protocol design. So on day 30, FDA will issue either IND may proceed a letter or clinical hold. This is really based on discussion during the information request. I'm not going to go detail why the clinical hold, but that will be separate topic. Next slide. So once you get your IND may proceed letter, that means the IND become active. So next step, you will try to find the clinical cell that later Jen and Victoria will address in their presentation. I want to just touch a little bit about the IND drug importation to the US. I'm not going to talk about what you are going to do or CPD, the US customer and the border protection agency. The FDA part, FDA has its own data system you need to use. But the important piece of the information is FDA, the IND may proceed letter. The letter will be used when you import the drug to the US. So that needed to be in the FDA system, and then that will needed to show the CPD. Next slide. So this is FDA rules in importing IND drugs. I'm not going to go through the details. This is just the system you're going to use. I'm sure this information you can find from FDA website. Next slide. Yeah, that is the same, the system information instruction. So next will be question. I'm closing my presentation for now. Sonia, your turn.
Okay, thank you so much, Frank. And yes, it is time for our second poll question. So there you go, audience members. Just like before, this is done in real time, so your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. Okay, so the question that we have for you is, what is your biggest concern about conducting a trial in the US? So we have a couple options below: navigating regulatory issues, finding KOLs, identifying sites, overseeing clinical operations, or all of the above. Okay, a few more seconds. Okay, that looks like it's the majority. Okay, a few more seconds. There you go. All right, I'm now going to close the polls and let's take a look at the results. Okay, so here are the results. We have 25% of our audience members are saying navigating regulatory issues. Then we have 4% saying finding KOLs. 17% of our audience said identifying sites. 0% saying overseeing clinical operations. And 54% of our audience said all of the above. So thank you everyone for participating in poll question number 2. Now we're going to bring it over to Jane. But before we pass the mic over to Jane, Jane was wondering, I'm actually curious, what your thoughts are about the results of that poll question.
Thank you, Sonia, for conducting the poll. This is quite interesting. I think I'm not surprised about one of the key concerns is around the sites, and also the all of the above. But there is, especially overseas clinical operations, it's a 0, which is very interesting. But I think that all of the above probably also include all those concerns, which I will going to cover in my section. Okay. So, yeah, and now the U.S., as Frank has mentioned, many biotech companies, come to the U.S. to conduct the clinical trial, and here is the world's #1 clinical trial market. It's a big market, very comprehensive, very complex. As you can look at this map, almost every state has the clinical trial sites or facilities. Majority of these facilities or clinical trial sites are located in the East Coast or the West Coast. And in trials are conducting almost every disease areas, and it's very competitive. But the therapeutic areas that the industry has reported that the most the trials are competing is first is oncology, and followed by central nervous system and cardiovascular disease area, and diabetes area, and autoimmune disease area. And this is very important to recognize these top therapeutic area, which means they are highly competitive. So for sponsors, that if you bring the study to the United States to execute in those highly competitive area, you have to prepare much more. You need to consider a very robust plan, and to ensure your study and your project is competitive compared to other clinical trials. Next slide, please. In the past 30 years, so in the United States, very comprehensive and ecosystem environment has evolved for life science companies to develop the clinical trials and then the new drug product. As you can see, all of these players, clinical trial sites and PIs, there are about 20,000 to 30,000 clinical trial sites in the United States. These that they can conduct from the early phase 1 to the post-marketing studies. More than 4,000 clinical CROs. And so they're ranging from small specialty boutique CROs to very large international CROs. I'm sure that the audience, you are very familiar with those top CROs, but actually there are many more specialty CROs that they focus on specific disease areas. In the clinicaltrial.gov, more than 300,000 registered the trials. So it's a very competitive environment. In the past 15 years, there are two areas that's a fast-growing area in this ecosystem. So one is trial technology service providers, and second area is the testing labs. So the technology vendors and also testing lab vendors, they offer the new technologies that can enable, for example, the virtual trial. They also support the many biotech companies to conduct biomarker or genomic-driven clinical trial. And some of these companies that their data can be utilized to identify the sites, identify that's the patient. And so that when the sponsor that when you come and then execute your study, that's even like what Frank mentioned about during your pre-IND stage, you're going to start to think about holistic plan at both strategic and operational level for your clinical trial execution, and try to avoid that the areas, the risk area for your study. Next slide, please. In this comprehensive environment, as I think that many of the audience mentioned, one of the key concerns is about identifying the trial sites. The trial site is absolutely a critical component. A sponsor need to well understand. I'm sure that many probably of you rely on working with your CRO partner to identify the sites. Now, you have to recognize is that U.S. healthcare systems, it's very different from healthcare system in APAC region and also in European regions. So in the U.S., in addition to academic centers, there are regional hospitals with research capability. There are community-based hospitals that they can conduct clinical research, and also physician groups. All of these different types of the healthcare providers or clinical trial sites, they have their own unique strengths. The academic centers are very good at conducting the early exploratory study, while the regional hospital, community-based hospitals, and the physician groups, they actually can access much larger the patient, the pool, and yearly they becomes as the referring site to the academic centers. So when the sponsor said you conduct your clinical trial, that you would be wondering why that's the sites and the patient would be interested to participate in my study, or they are not interested. There are many factors affecting their decision making, but there are a couple of the key factors I like to emphasize. Very first one is that given the scientific novelty of your compound or treatment, the very first thing is about clinical benefits your drug or your program will bring to patients. And clinical benefits are looked at compared to standard of care in the United States, and this is very, very important. And this has been emphasized than ever before. So it's not compared to standard of care in your local, that's the region. It's the standard of care in the United States. I've seen some of my clients is that when they design the protocol, they sometimes refer the treatment or standard of care in the Europe or in other region, but it's not actually standard of care in the US, which caused their study the execution of problem, and also that even that during the IND and the application, that will probably be questioned by the FDA as well. Then the second is about operability. which means that you will need a good protocol, but this protocol also has to be executed that's a very practical way in the United States, not just the good, that's on paper. Now, when the sites make a decision if they are willing to participate in the trial, they also have to look at their own staff capacity, especially in the past 2 years because of the COVID impact and also the job market change. This affects a lot of the sites and their staffing. If your study requires a lot of the staff support, it could becomes very challenging for the sites to participate in your study. And then finally is about the convenience. This is especially from the patient's perspective. The US patients are very savvy. Some of them do their own research to find out that's the clinical trials that could benefit for them to participate. So if they look at the tests and the procedures are not convenient for them to participate, they may not have that much interest. Next slide, please. The relationship between trial sites and sponsoring CROs has changed so much in the past 15 years. So the power has been shifted to the trial sites. So when especially for the sponsors and also your CRO partners, you really have to ask, what are the right sites for your study and how you can actually work, find out those right sites. There are a couple of the principles you really have to keep in mind. First is that recognize there are different types of the sites in the United States because of the healthcare, the system. You have to combine academic sites with community-based sites. You need to understand which sites they are good at early trial experience versus the late. And very important, you have to look at the trial competition landscape. Many of these companies that you do the studies in oncology, that's a highly competitive space. So when you look at the competition, not just look at the competition as a whole, but you also have to look at the potential sites, how that competition look like. So in our experience with many the sponsor, if that's a trial site has ongoing the clinical trials for like more than 5, targeting the very similar patient population, and then when you bring in your study yearly, you will not have the very good enrollment rate. For the sponsor and CRO, you also need to conduct evidence-based trial feasibility, which means that you probably will need to work with the expert specialists and some of the companies, they can leverage electronic medical records and biomarker genomic data, and that's available in the United States, allow you to identify a specific patient population and then the site. This is very important for those studies that's biomarker driven. And then you also have to understand the PI workflow. As I mentioned, if your studies that sites are most of the specialists, then they probably were going to need the patient to be referred from the primary care doctor. So how their workflow look like? Can they access those primary care doctor? You need to have that good understand. Very important, proactively work with your CRO partner. All of these items are not trivial. So for the sponsor, you really need to plan ahead. So when we see the plan ahead, you probably that when you do the pre-IND, these are the questions that needs to start. Next slide, please. I recognize that our first poll that about 60% of the audience already have experience conducting the study in the United States. And I guess that's probably you have, the experience of the different the challenges. So from our the experience with my clients, there are some of the top operational risks. I see that sponsors usually miss them. That in their early planning, they probably did not expect that was going to happen. One of the items is related to IP clinical supply. How, especially if you have the IP manufactured outside of US, and then how you get the IP export out of your local region and import it into the United States. If your team they don't have such experience, you probably need to work with a specialist and company to help you that export the product to the United States. There are quite many we have seen the studies got delayed because the delayed IP. The second area is about bioanalytical testing, especially that if your bioanalytical testing method, they are developed outside of the US, and then so you need to plan ahead about the method transfer with your US central lab vendors. So that will not delay your first the patient enroll. Other areas include companion diagnostic tests. If you consider that in your clinical study, you probably will need that much longer time actually to focus on companion diagnostic tests, and before that you can incorporate them into clinical trial. Also very important is about FDA GCP compliance and the requirements. The US FDA GCP requirements are not exactly the same as the GCP requirements, for example, in Australia, APAC region, or Europe. So you have to recognize that's the difference. In general speaking, I think it's a 2020 April, FDA has revised their GCP guideline and they raise a much higher bar. So sponsor has overall accountability, even though you outsource to the CRO, especially that the sponsor oversight responsibility of the CRO. This has been constantly missed. This is what in our experience with many biotech companies that either due to lack of experience or no local staff. So that the CRO oversight, especially the local working with your CRO partner, is missed, which also cause many potential operational risk that cross the whole clinical trial conduct. Next slide, please. And then finally, that key area is about CRO selection. It always asks, I got the question from our potential client and our existing clients, which CRO to choose. One of the principles I've seen, there is no straight, simple black and white answer for that. But the principle is that best CRO choice is not about the size. It's really about the fit. So what do we mean by fit? You have to looking at your CRO partner, their therapeutic area expertise, especially for the study you are going to do. Culture fit. This is very, very important. Does your CRO partner, they have experience in early phase study, especially working with a small emerging biotech companies, or your CRO partners are good at running the late stage study and their majority of the clients are big, the pharma. And these are different. And which actually have the different impact on the study execution. Are you the strategic or tier one client to your CRO? This is a very critical question. In reality is that if you are not your CRO partner strategic client, you probably will not get the 18. You may not get enough attention from your CRO partner, and your study will going to suffer. And also you need to ask your CRO partner their staffing capacity and turnover rate. If they have a very high turnover rate, the likelihood the PM who is going to run your study probably going to leave the project during the study conduct. And also very important, you're going to work with your CRO like your partner. It's a mutual support, understanding each other. We're going to make your study success. So I'm going to conclude my section right now. I hand it over to Sonia to conduct the final poll.
Actually, Jane, thank you so much for that, but we're going to skip the final poll and get right to Victoria. So Victoria, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Yep. Unfortunately, I'll try to go through these very quickly, and would be happy, of course, to follow up with anybody who wants more information. But I noticed that 34% of respondents said that they're planning to do a clinical trial in the U.S. And I noticed that a large number of respondents said that one of the things that they worry most about is finding sites and KOLs. And one of the best things that your CRO can do for you is to help to find the right investigators and the right sites for your clinical trials. So when you're thinking about doing a clinical trial in the U.S., you want to look for certain things with your CRO. You want your CRO to understand very clearly the clinical trial market in the U.S., and you want them to understand the treatment paradigms for different indications, because across different geographies, treatment paradigms for different diseases they vary. You want to make sure that your CRO has good relationships with different types of investigators for different types of clinical trials and for different indications. And you want your CRO to understand at each individual site what their startup processes and their timelines are, so that you can end up with the most appropriate patient population and sites with those patients in order to meet your particular study goals. And the bottom line is, one type of clinical trial center does not serve every sponsor's need, and it's very important to find the right clinical trial site and the right clinical trial investigator for your individual study. If you'll flip to the next slide, please, Sonia. Just to follow up on other requirements for CROs, one thing that matters is the development strategy, the clinical development strategy for your individual molecules, because the development strategy really matters for different types of molecules. You know, a gene therapy is different than a small molecule inhibitor, for example. And of course, the competitive landscape and the regulatory structure for different indications and different types of drugs. So you want to make sure that you're working with a CRO who understands all of those subtle nuances in the clinical development strategy for your molecule. Of course, all of your clinical trials are going to have different designs. And so you want to make sure that your CRO has experience working with different types of clinical trials: early phase, late phase, basket, umbrella, targeted therapeutics, therapeutics designed for specific populations, genetic mutations, or biomarker profile, things like that, and that they have experience in identifying the right patients for those types of clinical trials. You also want to make sure that your CRO understands what the enrollment timelines are for disease-specific indications. So if you're trying to enroll a study in third line, let's say non-small cell lung cancer, you need to understand what the enrollment projections are realistic for that particular patient population versus, a more rare indication where there are fewer patients that are even going to be available for clinical trials. And then you want your CRO to work with you very carefully to understand the impact of clinical trial, the design of the study and the study requirements on the ability to recruit to that study and the site's ability to conduct that study. So that's where understanding the patient population and understanding different sites and what their abilities are comes in handy. You save a lot of time if you pick the right sites from the get-go. And then something that people don't, they always forget about this, but it's really important. Almost all studies have vendors or other required service providers. And so you don't want your CRO to have to scramble to find the right vendor for your study. You want your CRO to already have relationships with vendors and other service providers. So the bottom line is understanding the needs for each individual study to ensure that you pick the right sites and the right vendors, and that you've got a good practical study design that can be implemented across the different sites that you need for your study in order to meet your accrual goals. Next slide, please, Sonia. So in working with different sponsors, there are always cultural and practical requirements that you want to consider. You want your CRO to to understand and to be able to help you with study design and clinical development strategy as well as regulatory requirements, especially when you're going from APAC into the US, because the requirements for a study are different in the US, and the success of a study often depends on the study design. So you want to make sure that your CRO is working with you to make sure that your study is optimally designed so that you can accrue and complete your study in the time frame that you would like. Especially when you're working with a sponsor from APAC, you want your CRO to understand how important it is to design the US implementation of a clinical trial in such a way that it still allows you to meet any requirements that you have back or that the sponsor has back in the home country or back in APAC, because the requirements are different in different geographies. So if you have requirements for your study back in your APAC country, you want to make sure that your CRO can implement things in such a way that the data is still useful to you to support whatever it is that you need back in APAC. Another thing that people always underestimate, but how important it is for your CRO to be mindful and considerate and be able to accommodate time differences between the US and APAC. You know, sometimes the time differences are very big. And so you want your CRO to understand and appreciate the time difference and to not, you know, not create hardships about being able to have scheduled calls to keep everybody updated on study progress and things like that. And there are cultural differences between U.S. and European and APAC sponsors, and so you want your CRO to understand those and be able to accommodate those cultures. Those cultural differences. One of the things that we see very often is having to think of creative ways to overcome language barriers, finding alternate ways to communicate, and making sure that we each understand what the other person is trying to communicate to us, so that we're always on the same page at the same time and we're moving forward together. If we're not, we end up losing time, and you know, time is money. The bottom line is you want your CRO to pay attention to detail, to always be willing to be creative and act flexibly to make sure that your needs as the sponsor are met and that the goals of your study are met. You want always to embrace each other's contributions from the outset so that you have timely completion of the research programs that you're trying to undertake. And on my last slide, please, Sonia. I just want to talk for a minute about the benefits of working with a specialty CRO. ARG is a specialty CRO, and we are known for being a CRO that provides what we call white glove service, which simply means white glove simply refers to providing an elevated level of service and attention to detail. So ARG and specialty CROs in general, they pride themselves on providing this extra level of service. Understanding when your study or when your business needs require customization. It's very common with early phase clinical trials, and especially with young or new or emerging companies. So you need to understand and be able to accommodate when customization is required. Your CRO absolutely has to understand that when you're a new company, a young company, or it's your first or earliest clinical trials, your needs and your timelines are going to change. They're going to change often multiple times, and your CRO needs to be able to accommodate those variabilities, and they need to be able to accommodate them in a very quick manner. You want your CRO to identify problems early and to develop solutions to those problems early, so that the study doesn't hit a block. You don't fall into a holding pattern because you've got a problem to resolve that you didn't anticipate. Most importantly, you want your CRO to recognize that corporate needs and milestones are very, very important, and so that the CRO tailors activities to make sure that we hit those milestones, or we provide the data that you need in order to hit your corporate milestones. We know that those are very important, especially for smaller and emerging companies. And the last thing that I want to say is you want your CRO to always provide very careful attention to the sponsor and your individual needs. Every sponsor is different, and every trial that every sponsor undertakes is important. And to a specialty or a white glove CRO, such as ARG, every sponsor is important and every trial is important. There aren't tiers of sponsors. No sponsor is more important or takes precedent over another sponsor. Every sponsor and every trial is important. So the bottom line is when you're looking for a CRO, you want to look for theoretically, you want to look for a specialty CRO that provides the white glove service that a service such as ARG provides. But you want your CRO to be proactive and flexible. You want them to be very sensitive to your needs and to be able to change and react very, very quickly as your plans and as the as the clinical trial progresses and data emerges or complications arise. You want your CRO to be very flexible and to respond very quickly. So in the interest of time, I'll stop here. Happy to speak and happy to answer any questions at any point. But at this time, I'll turn back over to Sonia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Victoria, Jane, and Frank for that very insightful and detailed presentation. We only have a few minutes to do some not poll questions, but our audience questions. So remember, audience members, you can send in those questions by using that questions window. And if we can't attend to your questions, the team at ARG will follow up with you. So let's get to our first questions. I have a lot of questions that have come in while you were speaking. This question here is for you, Frank. This audience member is asking, in some cases, is it feasible and appropriate to request first an early and later a late pre-IND meeting?
No, there's only one meeting, pre-IND meeting for one product. So when I use early pre-IND meeting or later pre-IND meeting, it's really the thinking from a sponsor's perspective, whether you want to contact FDA early or later when you have a GLP tox data. No, one product, one pre-IND meeting.
Okay, thank you, Frank. And let's go to our next one. Give me 1 second here. Our next question is, how does the FDA rule not accepting Chinese data only for approval?
Can you repeat?
Who would like to answer that?
Sorry.
Oh yeah, let me repeat that. How does the FDA rule not accepting Chinese data only for approval?
There's no legal frame or say that the Chinese data is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
It's really based on situations whether GCP compliant. Because right now the FDA is very, very care about the national trial. You have the diversity in the clinical trial, to reflect the U.S. population. That's basic requirement right now. But foreign data is still acceptable based on other 3 criteria, I think. Rare disease, there's no treatment available. New MOA, there's some other cases. I think FDA clearly said in the few months, at the advisory committee meeting a few months ago, contacted at the FDA side. I think maybe Jane and Victoria can provide more details.
Do you have a quick answer to Victoria?
Yeah, there are cases where just recently where drugs have been approved by the FDA based on data collected entirely in study conducted in APAC. So it is possible. The first approval of Enhertu comes to mind, where the study was conducted in Asia, and the data was so compelling, so overwhelming that the FDA approved based on that. Now it's gone on to a different study, and it's approved in an earlier setting based on more global data. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Jane, any last words there?
No, I think it's. I don't have the additional comments, but I think it's probably we can. There is another question related to this. I'd be happy to provide the feedback. I think it's the question about the why that comes to the U.S. To conduct the clinical.
Oh, if competition is so high in the U.S., sponsors should consider other countries in APAC when data is accepted by FDA, EMA, and PMDA. That audience was asking that. Do you have a quick answer for that before we wrap up?
Yes, I think that's first of all is that because pretty much every company that's your drug development also is important to consider the commercial success. regardless as you go to that as a market approval, selling the product, or that's a licensing, license out. And so the US market is by far the largest market. So the commercialization is very important. Now, if you need to consider that, now FDA, the latest guidance that they require that the US patient population needs to be considered, and then the standard of care in the US also has to be considered. That's in your clinical trial design, and also when you apply for the new product, the application. And so even though, yes, this is highly competitive, but there are also lots of the, as I mentioned, 20 to 30 the clinical trial sites, and that's they are capable of doing the clinical trial. And so that company needs to be planned well. That's when you conduct the trial in this state.
Okay, phew. We try to get it all in there. There's a lot of questions still left out, but I just want to say thank you.
Can I have
of course, Frank. Of course, Frank. Go ahead, add.
So one pre-IND for one IND, not for one product, because one product can have multiple indications, multiple IND. I just want to make a correction.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Frank, for clarifying that. Thank you so much, everyone, for sending in your questions. We have reached the end of the Q&A portion of this webinar. I know we couldn't attend to all your questions, but the team at ARG will follow up with you after this presentation. And if you have any further questions or inquiries, please go ahead and reach out to Mike Baker right here. That's his email address. He'd be more than happy to speak with you. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now, give me a few seconds. I'm going to send you a link in the chat box, and you'll be able to view the recording of this event with that link, and also share this link with your colleagues once they register for the recording as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Victoria, Jane, and Frank, for that very insightful presentation and for answering some of your questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at Xtalks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now. Thank you again, Jane, Frank, and Victoria. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.